Alan Reid if you have not met Alan at all. He's, of course, involved as Professor of Education at the University of South Australia. He's been involved for a long time in national and state professional organisations. His interests include policy, curriculum change, social justice and education, citizenship education, and history and politics of public education. Alan's published widely, and he's very involved in policy development at the state and national levels. In 4 and 5, he was appointed by the Minister of Education for a three-person panel that had a look into SASPA. He was engaged by the South Australian Department, DEX, to lead the development of a system-wide approach on research and inquiry. And so Alan has been with us for some time, working alongside, leading at times, and also inspiring people to have a think again about education and about how we need to reconsider it. Alan is going to be with us until 2:45. At that point, he's going up to get ready for the question and answers, and we've got a small amount of breathing time at that time to have a think about what it is that he's said, and then quietly walk up there to join him and then have drinks. So we're hoping that this will be an attractive way of sort of getting us thinking about things and then coming in for that rigorous discussion that Louise talked about, really a conversation about what it is that's important in education. Alan, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We look forward to it.
Thanks, Joe, for the introduction, and thanks to SASPA for the invitation to talk to you today. I've, as Joe said, only got now just 40 minutes, so I'm not going to start with my normal brilliant joke. I'm just going to go straight into it, 40 minutes. So the question that Peter asked me to talk about was this one up here. Do we have the right policy settings to produce world-class learners? And I think this emerged out of the keynote speaker that you had last year, the great Yong Zhao, the famous educator, who talks a lot about world-class learners. So when I sat down to prepare this, I actually thought about the concept of world-class learners. I must admit that a little bit cynical about terms like this, in 21st century learners, except I think they can be shorthand for meaning particular things. The only thing is we have to make very clear that we're on the same page when we're talking about a concept like world-class learners or 21st century learning. So when I thought about world-class learners, I assumed that there were things like, looking at the dictionary, they're among the best or foremost learners in the world, or they're learners at an international standard of excellence. That, of course, that doesn't tell us much at all, because the question remains, what's the reference point you're using? And who's going to decide that the people here are world-class learners, and how are they going to decide it? Now, like that, asking what's the reference point for the concept of world-class learners clearly demands consideration of things like what's the nature of the contemporary world for which we're preparing young people? What are the purposes of education? What future changes in society are likely to occur? Then we go across to how do people learn? And of course the question, what should be assessed and what's the best way to make these judgments? Now, there's many more questions that you need to talk about in arriving at the reference point that you're going to use to make judgments about world-class learners. And the answers, it seems to me, shape the kind of schooling we offer and the students, what we want the students to develop. And yet often it's assumed or it's just simply asserted. Often in education policy, which is designed to address a particular problem or issue, the statement is made that this solution will produce or give us world-class learners. And there's no kind of talking about what the beliefs and assumptions are which inform the policy. So policy is really important. You can't can't ignore it. Policy will follow you as principals into the office. It will follow teachers into the classroom. And it's really important, I'd argue, that any consideration of world-class learners must take into account the policies that are shaping your work. Now, I know that SASPA has been working on a 21st century learning statement, and I've got to say I broadly support all that's in the current draft. That's one part of the equation. The other part is to ask the question that we're talking about today. Have we got the kinds of policy settings that will help us develop this kind of learner, that would help us develop and implement this sort of curriculum? So I think answering those questions as principals, as leaders, is really important, so that you can play a role in influencing policy development, so that you know what it is that you're being asked to implement, and you work out how you want to work around it, whether or not you want to resist it, whether or not you want to embrace it. So the question of policy, I think, is fundamental. Because it seems to me at the moment that there's operating at least two parallel universes. Now, I'm generalising here, you'll understand this, but in the one universe are many educators. I say many because I understand that there are many educators that also sit within the second universe. But in the one universe, it's mainly educators, I think, that talk about diversity, the diversity of the learners, particularly in public schools that you're working with, and what that means for teaching and learning. To talk about inquiry-based teaching, engaging pedagogies. If you have a look at the SASPA document, there's terms like negotiation and personalised learning and blended learning. It's all about thinking about the future and what the world that we're preparing students for. That, it seems to me, and we haven't got all the answers. It's fantastic discussion and debate. It's the wonderful thing about education, that we can be so engrossed in talking about these really important and fundamental questions. But we haven't got all the answers. But it seems to me that's the kind of discourse that goes on in education circles. But then there's a second universe. And it seems to me that it's many, not all, policymakers and commentators, many of whom don't have much connection with schools, who seem to be arguing for a return to some golden age. I'd argue that it wasn't golden, the age to which they're referring, but it seems that there was something better back when. And their talk is about standards of decline, that we need to go back to basics, we need to have drilling and skilling. They often talk in false binaries, setting up one thing against the other, rather than coming to grips with the complexity of these particular things. And often it's about mandating rather than negotiating and creating flexibilities. So my sense is that these two parallel universes are occurring. So my argument is, no matter what kind of brilliant document SASPA develops, if the second universe is in the ascendancy, then it's not going to help all that much. Now, in terms of the second parallel universe, if you think I'm exaggerating, just 2 weeks ago, the Weekend Australian opened it up, and the front page was the heading Curriculum Shifts Focus to Core Skills, and there was a story about changes to the national curriculum. Now, I don't want to go through that story, but I do want to point out one thing, that in that article there were 4 key policymakers who were quoted. Now, these people, I think, are the most influential policymakers in Australian education. And I want to tell you what they said. The first one was Professor Stephen Schwartz, who has just been appointed as chair of ACARA, the national curriculum body. So a pretty significant position in terms of curriculum policy. Professor Schwartz has been Vice-Chancellor of Macquarie University. He's a very skilled, he was a very skilled education administrator. His academic expertise was in university admissions, health policy, pharmacoeconomics, and cost effectiveness. But he's chairing our national curriculum body. And in explaining why he thought Australia's NAPLAN standards were stagnant, he used these sorts of terms. That ACARA must rebalance the curriculum by streamlining subjects, by prioritising the basics and by mandating phonics. Now, we'll talk more about that in a minute, but the mandating of phonics, I think, is an example of these binaries, phonics or whole language. But Professor Schwartz was very much operating within that second parallel universe. The second one was our Federal Minister, the Honourable Christopher Pyne, who said in the same article that he wants a back-to-basics approach. He wants also to mandate phonics, and he wants to introduce direct instruction. Then the next two people were, and Christopher Pyne, of course, is a lawyer. The next two people were the two curriculum reviewers. They reviewed the national curriculum, pretty significant, came up with a number of recommendations which are currently being implemented. The first, Professor Ken Wiltshire, is a Professor of Public Administration, and he was arguing that the reason our NAPLAN results are stagnant is because in a number of states, they, deconstruct texts in English when they study Shakespeare and ask students to underline sexist passages in red and sexist and racist passages in blue, I think, or the other way around. Now, apart from the fact that one wonders how he's confused Year 12 results with Year 9 NAPLAN results, the fact that this notion that this is dominant in schools across the country in Year 12, of course, the next person, Kevin Donnelly, has been talking about this for years. I actually thought, what a brilliant exercise that is, to study Shakespeare and get inside. But apart from that, it's hardly anything that's going to dominate your curriculum and cause the fall in NAPLAN results. And the last, Dr. Kevin Donnelly is an educator, but he talked about wanting to focus on rote learning and phonics-based teaching in the early years to hardwire children's brains for learning. He talked about drilling students with basic skills and scrapping fads such as constructivism, a very legitimate theory of learning, personalised learning and negotiated curriculum. So the reason I highlight this is just to say this is important. These are our key policymakers, and I'm not necessarily, although by implication I am, critiquing what they're saying. What I'm saying is that what they're saying is very different from that first universe and the kind of document that SASPA has been playing around with. And I think that's a really important thing to come to grips with. So I want to expand my argument by looking at 4 aspects of the curriculum and just give some examples of how this second universe is playing out in curriculum and some of the concerns that I have about it. The first one is case study is who are the learners. So I just want to make a point of case study of learners. The second one, what's to be learned. A short case study about an aspect of the official curriculum. The third, how is learning fostered? A short case study about pedagogy. And the fourth, how is learning assessed? Assessment and accountability. Now these are just little snapshots into each of those 4 key curriculum moments, if you like, okay? I just want to give some examples. So, the first, the learners. A dominant characteristic of the Australian schooling system today is that it's highly socially stratified, both in terms of socioeconomic status and ethnicity. The proportion of students who attend a socially mixed school is lower in Australia than in most other comparable countries, including Canada, New Zealand and the UK. Now, I'm going to make an argument that the fact that we have a stratified and not very socially mixed schooling system does impact on the notion of world-class learners. But the question you've got to ask is how? How is it that Australian education has developed such a system which is highly stratified? To do that, and I've got very little time here to do it, so you might be thankful for that, because it's basically about funding policy. But many of you in this room, or some won't, but there's some in this room I know will remember Australian education in the 1970s, at a time at which schools were, that's public and private, were pretty socially mixed. Public schools carried about 80% of the school population and private schools about 20%. Of course, then there's the funny story that you know well. The early 60s, where many private schools were arguing that they were under-resourced, and many, of course, very poor Catholic schools were very under-resourced, and they needed money, and that the Menzies government decided to give money, federal money for the first time, to private and public schools in 1963 for science labs and for libraries. And the money continued to flow, and federal money continued to flow up until 1973, when Whitlam was elected. There was the famous Carmel Review into education, and out of the Carmel report came the recommendation for a more systematic approach to recurrent funding of both public and private schools from the federal government. And that really commenced this tug of war between the kind of funding regime that we should have. On the one hand was the needs-based funding, which Carmel had argued for. The argument that what we should do is identify what a current resource standard for a well-resourced school is, and Carmel said, yeah, that's public schools should be funded at 100% of that, and then we should give money to private schools to bring them up to that standard. Initially, the idea was that those above the standard wouldn't get federal funding. That fell in a heap when the very elite private school lobby argued strongly that they should also get money and started using the entitlement argument. So we got away from needs-based funding, that is bringing all schools up to the same standards of resources, to arguments about, well, we all pay taxes, don't we? And given that we do, we should all get federal government money. Not surprisingly, entitlement triumphed pretty quickly, and increasing amounts of money started to flow to the private system. When this first started, the public system was getting about 65% of the funds, the private system about 35%. That is now totally reversed. Now the public system gets about 35% of federal funds, that is, not state funds of course, and the private system gets 65%. Now the question is, how did the private schools spend this money? Well, what we know is in fact they didn't spend it on capping fees, which was often the argument as well, that this would enable choice, it would promote choice, and more students would be able to, parents would be able to choose between schools. In fact, fees kept going up, way above the CPI. Private schools, of course, were spending the money on making their schools what they saw as a perception of academic rigour. They focused on what they saw as discipline and values. They created smaller classes. They were able to employ more teachers, talking across the board and generalising. In turn, obviously, they attracted more custom, and what that did, naturally, was start the drift from the public to private schools. And that continued right up until 2010, when the Gonski Review looked closely at this system and said, hang on, this system doesn't work. This is dysfunctional, it's inequitable, it's unfair. And they came up with a system, a return, if you like, to needs-based funding. And for a time it looked like, because both the public and the private sectors were on the same page with this, that we actually had found a way around it. As you now know, needs-based funding has been abandoned with Gonski. Now, the reason I gave you that bit of background, going back to learners, is to say, all right, what impact does it have? Well, have a look at the impact on enrolments. In 1972, you see government schools had 78% of enrolments. In 2011, it was 65%, and 65%. And my understanding is that if you went to 2015 now, it might be closer to 64%. Non-government schools, on the other hand, 22% have gone to 35%. So that 13 or 14% increase in the enrolments of private schools has come about since that funding regime started. Now, that's okay. You could say that's all about choice, but was it? Let's have a look at what actually, where the enrolments were coming from. That graph, I'll just quickly describe it. Each of the three bands, the first band is the lowest socioeconomic status groups, then the next up, moving from the left, is the lower, the next higher, and the next highest. and the three bars are 1986, 1996 and 2006, okay? Now if you look at the lowest SES, you'll see that there's no movement in public schools. That is, this drift didn't come from the lowest SES. Now look along across to the three bars on the right-hand side, and you'll see that's where enrolments were falling in the public system. That is, the drift to private schools came almost entirely from the higher or highest socioeconomic status groups. The Gonski report in 2011 said that the highest SES in the highest SES quartile of all the students in independent schools, nearly half of them were from the highest SES quartile, and in public schools, of all the students, about 22% from the highest SES quartile. And then in the lowest SES quartile, of all the students in independent schools, about 13%, and in public schools, all our students, about 36% are in the lowest socioeconomic quartile. And the final bit of impact is enrolments of disadvantaged students by school sector, and you'll see that the public system in blue takes 82% of the lowest SES students, 84% of Indigenous, 80% of remote, 87% of very remote, 76% of disabilities. Now, the reason I've gone through that is to say all of that quite clearly has an impact on student achievement. For a while we were talking about individuals, and we always, for a long time, recognised the impact of SES on student achievement. But more recently, overseas and here, researchers have been looking at correlating the SES of students and the SES of their schools. And they're finding that no matter what data they use, the same pattern emerges. I'm going to use Richard Teese's Year 5, the data he used. He just took Year 5 NAPLAN results in 2009. And what he did was this. He, using my school data, it was from NAPLAN data, he took the students and he grouped them into quartiles of lowest, lower, highest and higher. Then he grouped schools into lowest, lower, higher and highest, and then he mapped their NAPLAN results. Well, this is what he came up with. You'll see that the four lines of the vertical part of the graph is the NAPLAN scores in reading. The horizontal part are the schools, okay, lowest, lower, higher and highest, and then he's mapped onto that the students from lowest to highest SES. And surprise, surprise, well obviously it wouldn't surprise anyone in this room, the red line, which is the lowest students in SES, finished below the average, this is the average score of the lower SES students, below the higher SES students and below again the top SES students. That's all pretty obvious. What's fascinating is that you'll see as, the horizontal one, as we go up in the social mix of schools, results increase. That's really fundamental, and as I say, this has happened in all the other research that they've done. That is, the more socially mixed a school, the better its outcomes. And that's why I'm talking here about policy and the argument that education policy, funding policy, has had an impact on student learning. One of the best, but not the only way, obviously we have to spend money on teaching and resources and all of those sorts of things, but one of the key things we'd do if we wanted to improve student outcomes is to ensure that our schools are more socially mixed. So Perry and McConaughey sum it up by saying, the segregation of schools, according to SES, provides further benefits for students whose economic circumstances allow attendance at high SES schools, and also further handicaps students who lack this advantage. That is, schooling that is segregated by SES is most likely to benefit students who are already privileged, but harm students who find themselves at educational disadvantage associated with low SES backgrounds. Rather than mitigating or mediating educational inequality, school segregation exacerbates it. So that's really my first point. In addition to having an impact on student achievement, of course, it also has an impact on learning to understand and respect difference. We're trying to develop in young people the capacity to work with kids from different backgrounds, different cultures, different ethnicities. It's a wonderful thing about public schools, that there is this microcosm of society there, and kids can learn from and with one another. It makes it more difficult, but by heck it makes for better citizens, I'd argue, than students being cosseted in more homogenous settings, where they're all from affluent backgrounds, or all from a particular religion, or all from a particular ethnic group. So I think it has an impact on learning to understand and respect difference. I think it has an impact on learning resources. Obviously, if schools are losing higher SES parents, you're not just losing their social and cultural capital, you're also losing, of course, their economic capital. And the capacity of schools to raise money as they lose the parents that do have some money, I think, is impacted. And finally, it does have an impact on curriculum breadth. There's some research just come out of Western Australia showing that the lower the SES school, the more limited the range of secondary offerings in, say, for example, high status academic subjects than schools in high SES categories. And of course, things like that cause parents to think about whether or not they might take their students elsewhere. Now, all of that isn't by way of depressing you, because I mean, the thing about this is the research out now shows that public schools do better than private schools when you compare like schools. That's the key thing, when you compare like schools. Overall, the elite private schools are doing much, getting raw scores are much better. When you compare like schools, public schools are doing better. In other words, public schools, I think, are doing a wonderful job working with the diversity of the students they've got. But it's made so much harder by the fact that for many public schools, that diversity is being decreased as students from some particular backgrounds leave, largely shaped by government policy. I think, therefore, we should be praising public schools for the job they're doing, even as we try and argue for a fairer system of funding. And clearly Gonski was one answer to that. So that's my first case study. My second is the official curriculum. Now, usually it's the official curriculum, what's written down, the intended curriculum, if you like, that's the focus of public debate. I think this is wrong in a way, because people think there's a one-to-one relationship between what's written down, what you're going to learn, and what people actually learn. But still, it's still an important aspect of the whole curriculum debate. And it's the place where claims about world-class learners are usually made. Now, around the world, I think there's this kind of dawning realisation that it's the damage that's being done to the quality of education by the obsession with standardised test results. We know that in the United States and England, parents and teachers and education groups and prominent academics are warning about the consequences of focusing so heavily on standardised test results. They point to the damage that high stakes testing can actually do to schools and to systems. And all of that, the cheating, the teaching to the test, the narrowing of the curriculum, the excluding some students to gain advantage, and so on. But the consequence I want to talk about today, and one that's attracting a lot of attention, is the flow-on effect of the standardised testing obsession on the rest of the school curriculum. It's becoming increasingly apparent that areas such as creativity and critical thinking and intercultural understanding and digital literacy and so on are being pushed aside in the rush to improve standardised test scores. When so much store is placed on just two areas of the curriculum, and when the associated accountability mechanisms involve naming and shaming, who can blame educators for placing less emphasis on other areas of education? I think the tragedy is that Australia had built up a reputation as having a broad and comprehensive curriculum, and I think that reputation is increasingly under threat. It's no coincidence that policymakers in Shanghai, that is the place that is top of the PISA tables, the international testing, are looking at Australia and asking questions. They're concerned about the narrowing of of their curriculum, the narrowness of their curriculum, and they're looking to Australia, which they think has got a much broader curriculum. It's therefore ironic that if they're doing that, we seem to be trying to narrow ours down. But I think it's here that South Australia has a rare opportunity, because we have an Education Minister who said about 3 or 4 months ago that she wanted a broader approach to accountability. And I think if this is followed through seriously, that South Australia actually could be a leader in this field. We clearly have to have some comprehensive research and systematic research which looks at what schools are currently doing and so on. But I think before that project gets underway, we want to clear away a few of the embedded assumptions which often obscure the debate. The most obvious of these is the repetitive refrain that we need to focus on the old basics, which usually means versions of literacy and numeracy taught through traditional means, including drilling and skilling and rote learning. Now, this simplistic assumption is usually accompanied by the claim that those who reject it are either opposed to accountability or don't want literacy and numeracy standards to rise. Of course, both of these assertions are incorrect. It may indeed be important to focus on the basics first, but why restrict the basics to just 2 areas? Surely in today's world there are a number of other basics, you can call them the new fundamentals, without which it would be difficult to function as a productive member of society. More than this, the development of literacy and numeracy can actually be enhanced through attention to these other areas. Far from being defenders of standards and rigour, it's those who support the obsession with standardised tests in literacy and numeracy who I think are weakening our education system. Without their baggage of incorrect assumptions, it would be possible to develop a consensus about the knowledge and skills that might comprise the new fundamentals. Now, in a sense, we've got a version of them. They're there. They're called the general capabilities. You can think of those as the new fundamentals. You know them. They're critical and creative thinking and personal and social skills and ethical understanding and intercultural understanding and information and communication technology, as well as literacy and numeracy. Now, but when those 2 reviewers that I referred to earlier looked at the curriculum, they came up with this. They said, whilst various official documents acknowledge the importance of a discipline-based approach to education, such agreement is weakened by the emphasis on cross-curricular priorities, general capabilities, and a utilitarian and technocratic approach to the purposes of education and how best to design the curriculum. Now, in fact, what you see here are all the classic mistakes. First of all, there's the binary, disciplines versus general capabilities, as though they're competing for space. Then they're labelled as utilitarian. Then there's a total lack of understanding of what role the general capabilities actually play in curriculum terms. In fact, the general capabilities, I think, are essential to living and working and being community members in our society today. Not only do they not exist independently of learning areas and disciplines, they cannot exist without them. They're developed through the subjects. They're identified separately in the national curriculum to encourage educators, to encourage all educators to see what they can do in all subjects across all year levels to develop these general capabilities. So it seemed to me the general capabilities held this promise of actually unifying the curriculum in a way. But instead, this opportunity that we have to develop world-class learners, to look at ways of assessing some of those other capabilities that the Minister has said that we might be doing, appears to be being squandered because of the curriculum review. What we need are teaching and assessment approaches, I think, that instead of reverting to the old basics, look at some of these new fundamentals like the general. The third one is a case study in pedagogy. Now, this, I think, is one of the ones that's really concerning for me because, I mean, no matter what the official curriculum, the intended curriculum was like and how much intervention there was, you usually had politicians keeping out of the classroom. In the last 5 years, what's developed is this penchant for actually coming into the classroom and talking about the kind of pedagogy that people should be using. Now, usually this approach starts with the well-known platitude that, and I quote, "Research demonstrates that the quality of the teacher is the most important in-school factor which promotes student learning." Now, if you say that seriously enough, it can sound quite profound. The quality of the teacher is the most... I mean, when did anyone ever consider there was anything else other than that? The quality of the teacher, our key resource, is clearly the most important in-school factor. But of course, once you say this, and if you say it often enough, it's a small step just to making some other claims. And the most prominent of these is to take the quality of the teacher as an independent variable, and then dismiss as irrelevant such matters as class size, teaching resources, and factors of educational disadvantage. And once that's done, it's possible to claim that all the money spent on those peripheral matters has resulted in reduced learning outcomes, and hey presto, you have an educational justification for reducing expenditure. Of course, it's not as easy as that. That kind of thing, I think, is a nonsense. It's the interrelationship of the variables in the context of the learning which is so important. They can't sensibly be separated out like that. But having isolated teacher quality, the government is able to focus on those strategies which it claims will enhance it. And this demands a view of what good teaching looks like. And our Federal Minister, Pine, hasn't been shy to articulate his view of good teaching. I'll give you 3 quotes. "We need more practical teaching methods based on more didactic teaching methods, more traditional methods, rather than the child-centred learning that has dominated the system for the past 20, 30 or 40 years. Or a quote from an article in interviewing Pine, "New Education Minister Christopher Pine invites us to imagine classrooms where teachers return to old school instruction, becoming more of a deliverer of facts, less of a convener of activity-based learning." And finally, my instincts, this is the Minister's instincts, tell me that a back-to-basics approach to education is what the country is looking for, what parents feel comfortable about. Now, if that was just the Minister saying that, that's okay. Unfortunately, it appears that he's gone one step further and started to talk about the type of instruction that we should have in all schools. And here, I refer to the terms direct instruction and explicit teaching, or explicit instruction. Now, I mean, the first thing to say about this is that there's a confusion in the Minister and many policymakers' minds about the distinction between direct instruction and explicit teaching. They're both two very different things. Direct instruction came out of the United States in the late 60s, early 70s, and it was a minute, step-by-step, teacher-proof approach to teaching basic skills. That is, you disregard the teacher, whose only job was to be the vehicle for putting in place the stuff that had been decided. It was highly behaviourist in nature. Do this and this will follow. That's direct instruction. Explicit instruction, by contrast, is a little bit more flexible than that, but it's still based on transmission pedagogy. That is, the theory behind transmission is that you give some information, the students internalise it through some activity, they then reproduce it in some way in their assessment. Now, you can have some very sexy activities which dress up, but basically the learning theory is still that. It's explicit instruction, and I just want to say how this is so overblown, because I don't know an educator that would be opposed to using explicit instruction for some part of their work. But why it would become the one and only methodology you would use, I think, is quite frightening. And there's a guy called John Fleming. Has anyone heard of him? John Fleming was a teacher in a public school who moved to Harrogate College, a very wealthy private school in Victoria, and began to float the idea of explicit teaching. He then, if you like, developed it as a product that he was going to sell around the place, and he sold it very successfully. He goes around the country talking about explicit teaching, and his model, which is, I do, we do, you do. Now, I've been dying, because I haven't met John Fleming, to actually tell him that this 150-year-old model of give the information, internalise the information, reproduce the information isn't new, but that's explicit instruction. But okay, if that was just one part of it. Well, what we get then is this claim, and this is from a quote from an interview of his. Explicit instruction is the umbrella. Whatever you talk about, if If you talk to me about inquiry, it falls under explicit instruction. If you talk to me about experiential learning, it actually fits under explicit instruction. If you talk to me about developmental learning, it all fits under, because for any learning activity to be effective, it has to be taught step by step. Now, I don't want to state the obvious, so I thought I'd just show this that I use sometimes with just undergraduates about ways of thinking about teaching. And I argue that what you should do as a teacher is come with a kit bag of skills and approaches which are based on the students you've got, your learning theories, the context of the course and so on. Anyway, this is the chart I use. And on the left-hand side, I say, in any classroom, you'll move. Sometimes you're more teacher-centred, other times you're more student-centred. That's teacher-centred, other times you're more child-centred. That's on the left-hand side. Then there's basic approaches. If you're going to be more teacher-centred, you might use one of the process models of teaching. And there are any number of those. If you see those models of teaching there, the inquiry model, the negotiated model, where you're actually trying to teach something specific. The inquiry model is designed to develop in kids the capacity to hypothesise and then to test their hypothesis. It was developed by Richard Sachman in the United States, based on what scientists do. It is a rigorous step-by-step approach to developing kids' capacity to learn how to learn. There's lots of these process-type approaches. And down the other end, when you need to be more didactic, there's a transmission model, there's a demonstration model, there's the behavioural model, which is very much direct instruction. The reason I just show you that is to say, my view is that good teachers come with that capacity to be able to say, this is what we want to teach, these are the learners in my care, I want to be up the child-centred end this time, or I want to move down to the teacher-centred end because I want to do something that's quite specific. What we've got are policymakers who are talking about, if you move to the third family of teaching models, that bottom one, a behavioural approach, and saying, as Fleming said, that this is the umbrella. So, sorry to get passionate about that, but I just think it's a problem. It's quarter to. Where's Peter? I better fit. I'll leave my last one. My last one was going to be PISA, and as the example of assessment and accountability, and to argue that PISA is, if we just took it as one bit of information in the, all the data that we've got, would be quite useful to us, to systems, to say, yeah, actually it looks like we might have an issue here, we need to investigate this in greater depth. But unfortunately it's not like that. The PISA results come out, and ministers then pronounce, we're on the decline, we're on the slide. Well, in fact, we're not. Actually, I will show you that you know what PISA is. But we're equal 10th in reading, equal 8th in science, and equal 17th in maths. The key point I was going to make was simply that the PISA test, if we are going to take it seriously, we should recognise that it is shot through with technical flaws. And I was going to go through some of those technical flaws. And I think these are increasingly becoming apparent. There's more and more being written about this. And I'm not saying don't have international tests. What I'm saying is let's be careful about what we do with them. Anyway, I won't go through all of that. I'll just conclude by saying in this paper I've tried to make the case that the concept of world-class learners is meaningless unless the reference point for what constitutes world-class learning is spelled out. We need to do this as a system, and I think that SASPA is doing some good work there. What is it we want our young people to be and be able to do in the 21st century? But we must also take into account the policy context and the beliefs and assumptions upon which policy is based. I've argued that current policy contradicts and prevents the kind of curriculum approach being advocated by SASPA, and I've used 4 case study examples: the learner, what's to be learned, how it's to be taught, and the assessment approach. SASPA and other professional groups, I think, have got to get into the policy game to try and influence and shape. Because if educators aren't doing it, then I'm afraid the second parallel universe is going to win sway. It's not until the 2 parallel universes come together, where educators and policymakers are on the same page, that we can seriously talk about developing world-class learners.